been teaching at Muss for about 15, going on 16 years. I've been teaching at Muss. Um, I also really enjoy teaching online to adults, so I'm glad we have this opportunity. I don't know if anyone was in my first class a number of weeks ago about the Gaza conflict in general and about kind of Israel's right to defend itself. I want to tackle another pretty loaded issue today, which is nowadays it's a really important one, which is this idea of Israel's right to exist in the first place. If anyone here is on social media, but even if you're not, you probably maybe you've been hearing chants or reading articles about people chanting or this new idea, especially I shouldn't say it's not so new, but it's become especially accepted to talk about it lately since October 7th. This idea that Israel is just a colonial enterprise that should be dismantled, right? They have there's this word that you might be hearing a lot called, which they use, which is decolonization. The idea that which means it's generally used by Gen Z or millennials, whatever we call these people, but they're basically saying that Israel has really no right to exist whatsoever. Bunch of the way they frame the entire conflict is excuse me is is one of basically a bunch of bunch of rich white European colonists that came in and basically and really invaded the poor, downtrodden, dark-skinned Middle East. We're like the last and the worst example of colonialism, kind of like what the British did all around the world and ruined the world. That's what we are, and therefore that's why the conflict is happening. That's why we support the Palestinians. That's why the Palestinians are justified in, you might have heard the phrase "by any means necessary," which is basically support for violence, which is what people have been doing since October 7th. And the reason why they would say things like "by any means necessary" is because they believe that we're colonialists, basically. So, Ivy, you can hear now? Great, perfect. So, so I said we're going to tackle a big topic today, which is this idea that Israel is a colonial enterprise. That real extremists, real Israel haters, they don't talk about a two-state solution. They talk about dismantling Israel because we have no right to exist because we're a bunch of white European colonists, basically. And I want to kind of tackle that head on. And at this point, I'd say since October 7th, it's a really important issue. It's always been an important issue, but it's especially become much more accepted. This idea that Israel just shouldn't exist at all, because of that. That's who we are. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of cut to the heart of the conflict here, but the beginning of the conflict, which is the 1920s. It's really kind of post World War I. So you have to understand, just a little tiny bit of Jewish history, which is just for background's sake, which is that the Jewish people, obviously, as we know, originated here in Israel, was forcibly removed first by the Babylonians. We actually come back, which is its own miracle. But then in the year 70 CE, we are forcibly exiled from this land again. It didn't happen in one fell swoop in 70, but there's a number of 3 failed revolts against Rome, which lead to almost every Jew leaving this land by the year 135 CE or so. And so Jews are mostly gone. There's a few Jews that stay behind, but most Jews will leave as a result of difficulty living under the Roman Empire. I'll just say one more quick thing. I actually taught a Zoom class this morning and my internet went crazy, and every few minutes it signed me out and I had to sign back in. If that happens, let's hope it doesn't happen. But if it does happen, just sit tight. I'll come back in a minute and try to fix it. So don't worry if it does happen. If I freeze, just sit tight for a minute. Anyway, so a bit of Jewish history. The Romans kick us out of here. That's how Jews ended up all around the world. First in Western Europe, eventually into Eastern Europe, and in other places too, across the Middle East, and eventually, of course, we get to places like the United States of America. And then at a certain point in the late 18, and that's how Jews lived for a long time. The vast majority of Jews living, almost everybody outside the land of Israel. And in the late 1880s, or early 1880s, excuse me, 1881 begins the modern Zionist movement, which is as a result of the pogroms of Russia. A lot of Jews start to come back to this land. They say, enough is enough. Living as a minority hasn't worked. Even after the Enlightenment, even in modernity, when the whole world should stop being anti-Semitic, well, guess what? It didn't work out. And that is going to be one of the major causes for modern Zionism. and the huge Zionist movement, kind of a result of a new wave of anti-Semitism, at the same post Enlightenment and into modernity, and people in Europe saying there's just no escape. There's just no escape from this anti-Semitism thing. So we've got to go back home, and that's going to be kind of what precipitates the Zionist movement. Now, what happens initially is Jews are going to buy land. That in and of itself is not without controversy, because that land, it's worth understanding this. A big part of the Palestinian narrative, it's worth knowing, is that the Jewish people buys land. And on that land, in some cases, were tenant farmers, right? We bought the land from the landowner who might have lived, could be many miles away. A lot of these rich landowners lived in big cities, and they owned large estates, huge areas, huge swaths of land. And we're going to buy this land. Now, we're going to buy, in many cases, the worst land at the craziest prices with the most malaria. But there were cases in which there were tenant farmers, there were peasant farmers living there. And Jews, at a certain point, no longer want all these non-Jews to do our hard labor for us. If you know anything about Zionism, especially labor Zionism, the kibbutz movement, there's this idea that, we don't want to be the kind of people that only knows how to be, sorry for the stereotypes, but only knows how to be doctors and lawyers. And every time you need to put up a cabinet, you have to call a non-Jew to do it, right? I mean, this is unfortunate. This is certainly how I grew up in Philadelphia. And the fact of the matter is that part of the Zionist movement was remaking the Jew so that, no, we can put up our own cabinets and we can defend ourselves and we can do we can build homes and we can farm. And that meant that when we are purchasing these farms, in many cases, we asked the people that were living there who weren't owners, who were renters, to relocate. Now, to relocate not far. They didn't have to go very far, but in some cases, these people were very upset about this. I don't blame those local Palestinians. I mean, this is the kind of thing that happens to people all the time. I don't know if you've ever rented before, and then the house is sold, and the new owners come and say, "Sorry," that's what happens. That's the way the world works. But it still is gonna lead to some ill will. Now, and that's gonna be kind of the very, very roots of the conflict between Jews and Arabs in this land. It was completely legal purchases, completely public purchases. Nothing was done in an underhanded way. But some of these local tenant farmers are going to be very put off, unhappy with the fact that all of a sudden they've got to move down the road. All right, now that's just a little bit of background. Now, a tiny bit more background is that World War I is going to happen when we are purchasing this land initially. It's under the Ottoman Empire. Okay, Ottoman Empire though is going to fall and collapse in World War I. So what I want to do to understand the conflict, really, you got to get into kind of what happens during and post World War I. So that's where we'll start the kind of the modern day conflict, which is right after World War I. So really 1921 is usually the year that people give for kind of the first year of the conflict as we know it. And here's what's going to happen during World War I, which is going to start to precipitate this conflict. First of all, so I have a slideshow here. If you have any questions, you can feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you. So first of all, you have this initial problem, which is that the British are going to promise this land to 3 different groups, okay? And that, of course, is going to lead to conflict, obviously. They're going to promise the land initially secretly, in secret letters. The British are going to promise pretty much the entire Middle East to basically the most important Arab family, which were based out of Mecca, okay? And they were promised, remember, these countries don't exist yet. This is before nationalism in the Middle East. But what later became Israel and Jordan and Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and Saudi Arabia, all of that was promised to this one family. Now, meanwhile, the British also secretly promise parts of this, meaning Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. Of course, that matches up with much of what you see up here to the French. And so you have an issue where this land, the state of Israel, or what's later going to become Israel, but also other places in the Middle East will be promised both to the Arabs and the French. And then you have a third promise, of course, which we all know, the Balfour Declaration, November 2nd, 1917, in which what was then called Palestine, which was made up of what later became Israel and Jordan, are going to be promised to the Jewish people. And so you all of a sudden have, there's a book called The Thrice Promised Land, because it was promised by the British to 3 different groups. And of course, this is going to lead to, there already was the recipe for conflict here, like I said before. But now all of a sudden, the British are making things much worse by making promises. Now, these 2 are secret, just so you know. These 2, the promise to the Arabs was secret promise to the French was a secret promise. promise to the Jewish people was not secret. It was open. It was public. It was also ratified by multiple parliaments in multiple countries, which is one of the reasons why I believe I mean, even if you're going to say that the McMahon letters are also valid, that the Arabs were promised this land, if you're wondering why is our promise more valid than their promise? Well, the main reason is that their promise was secret and our promise was public and ratified by multiple countries. But despite that, to me, that's actually not so important. I'm even willing to say that maybe both promises were valid, and that the British are just kind of really screwing things up here in the Middle East. All that being said, what's going to happen post-war is this. There's a question of how this is all going to work out, because you have the British and the French here in the Middle East. They're trying to kind of take part of it for themselves. Well, the League of Nations, right, the precursors of the UN, the League of Nations is going to tell the British and the French, no, you cannot simply colonize the Middle East like you want to. What you're going to have is a mandate, okay? And the French are going to get a mandate in Syria, and the British are going to get a mandate in Palestine. Now, and it's important to understand what this means, because when the League of Nations, which was the only international law body at the time, and it's important to understand that the current UN adopted all resolutions of the League of Nations. So we're now living in a world that was partially shaped by the League of Nations. Even though it was short-lived, the current UN adopted officially everything that was ever adopted by the League of Nations. Well, what did the League of Nations say was going to happen to Palestine? Again, we have an issue here. We have the British promised it away 3 different times. What should we do? Well, the League of Nations makes it quite clear. And what they basically said was the Arab world is going to be turned over to the Arabs. And there's going to be multiple countries that are going to become Arab countries. There's going to be, and of course, we all know what they are. There's going to be many, many, many Arab countries. But there's going to be one tiny sliver of the Middle East that's going to be given to the Jewish people. And that's, of course, called Palestine. Now, at the time, it actually wasn't so tiny, meaning I'll show you a map of it. Actually, I think I have it over here. Here, this is essentially worth knowing. This initially was what was promised, right? When the League of Nations had the idea that Palestine would become a Jewish state, it looked like this. So if you're familiar with the geography of Israel, this is actually this side, of course. You can look at the bottom map. This is modern day Israel, of course. And on the right here, that's modern day Jordan. So once upon a time, actually, this was all supposed to be the Jewish state. The initial promise by the League of Nations, fulfilling the Balfour Declaration of the British, was all of this to go to the Jewish people, and everything else in the Middle East will go to the Arabs, basically. I'm simplifying things a little bit, but that's basically what they said. Now, it's important to actually see just a few lines from the League of Nations mandate. Because the League of Nations mandate, once this happens, this is a pretty crucial point. This is when international law officially adopts the idea that this land should become the Jewish state. That's a big deal. The fact that international law, the only real legitimate international law ever, ratified by multiple countries, and we still live in a world where the UN on a certain level still matters. Only on some, we know the UN's a little bit or a lot controversial, but on a certain level, part of what they say matter. But certainly the idea of international law, is important. It's important for us to realize, people often talk about the fact that, why doesn't Israel follow international law, and Israel doing this illegally and that illegally? 99% of what they say is garbage. It's not true. But it's crucial for us in this room to understand that, or us in this call to understand that international law is explicit about Israel being the national home of the Jewish people. So what does this say? I'll give you just a few quotes that are important. So this is the League of Nations mandate. This is, and the mandate means that the British have a role. They basically have a job to do in Palestine, and then they should leave. So what is their job? Their job is to turn it into a Jewish state. So it says here that the British should fulfill, I'll just paraphrase here. It says here the British should fulfill the Balfour Declaration, right? That's what they wanted them to do, which means turn Israel into a national home for the Jewish people. And this is actually the most important line, in my opinion. It says, whereas recognition has there been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country. That word is really important to me, reconstituting. This idea, when people nowadays say Israel, it's a colonial nation. Israel, how dare you? Why do you even exist? You're not from there. You took someone else's land. Well, the League of Nations was quite clear, actually, that the reason why Israel exists is not because of anti-Semitism, and it's not because of the Holocaust, of course, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. It's actually because there is a historical connection between Jews and this land, and we are reconstituting. We are remaking a home in that country that existed once upon a time. And that's why there's, of course, a huge difference between Israel, the state of the Jews being in where we are now, in the land of Israel, versus if it happened to be in Italy or Texas or Uganda or Argentina. All these places, we would actually have no real reason for being there. But the League of Nations knows, of course, that no, we have a historical connection with this place. And that's why we're going to reconstitute the Jewish national home there. That's really important. League of Nations also says a few more things. I'll just paraphrase this. It says that the British can't give any of the land away. It says that the British need to help us move to Israel. The British have to facilitate immigration to Israel. And then here's the important part. It says when the Jewish people is ready for a home, politically and economically, that's when the British are supposed to leave. Now, I want to make a really important point based on that last one, right? The question is, when did the British do their job? When did they fulfill the mandate? When are they supposed to go and make this land a national home for the Jewish people? When do we get our independence? When are the Jewish people supposed to have it? So it's pretty amazing. I'll use this chart again. I want to do a lot tonight. I don't want to be here too long, so I don't think I'll read the entire thing, but I'll read a few basic points from here. I just want to paraphrase and make an important point. If you look at all of these are the massive waves of Jewish immigration into Israel. Okay, there's 5 what are called aliyot. An aliyah is a massive wave of immigration, and each one of these aliyot is going to bring with it certain Jewish institutions. And the question that I always ask is, okay, if the British were supposed to leave when we're ready for a state, so the question is, of course, are we ready for a state? And now I'll skip the first aliyah, but we'll go to the second one. Okay, 1904. This is right before World War I. So 40,000 people move here, okay? In addition to about the 30,000 that already lived here. So we're talking about 70,000 Jews in the country. The city of Tel Aviv is founded during this time. Our early self-defense group called HaShomer is founded. We have a big high school and the Technion, which is still an important engineering school in Haifa. The question is, are we ready for a state yet? I think the answer is obviously not, right? We don't really have an economy. We don't really have infrastructure. We only have 70,000 people, okay? Now, if we skip to the 3rd and 4th and 5th aliyah, here's what I want to show you. Eventually, we get 35,000 new people, 40 new towns, all these public works projects, roads and sewage, things like that. We get multiple banks in the country. Of course, we start to have an economy. We get an actual self-defense group. We get basically an army here. We start governing ourselves with the Jewish agency starting in, I think it was 1920, okay? So all of a sudden, we're in the 3rd aliyah. We're in 1923. Now we have about 100,000 people. We have our own government. We have an economy. We have self-defense. We have multiple schools. We have infrastructure. Some people would say we might be ready for a state already now. Now, I would argue that, okay, well, we're only 100,000 people. That's a pretty small state. Maybe we need to wait a little longer. All right. 4th aliyah, 70,000 more people. 5 cities are founded, including Haifa and Herzliya. I have theaters in here. Why? To show you that starting in the mid-20s, there's culture in this country. There's theaters and there's leisure time. It's not like everyone's just draining swamps and planting trees and trying to not die from malaria. By the mid-20s, this country is basically functioning normally, right? That's what theaters are supposed to symbolize here. Hebrew University, founded in the mid-20s, of course. And finally, we have the 5th aliyah. And the 5th aliyah, which ends in 1939, of course, with World War II beginning, 235,000 people make aliyah. Many of them were Germans because Hitler, of course, is elected in 1933. So 235,000 people make aliyah. We have an electric company. We have an oil line from Iraq. We have all this. And all of a sudden, what you have in this country is by 1939, you have something like the population, I have to check exactly, but the population is something like 350,000 or 400,000 people in the country, an independent government, an independent self-defense group, an independent Jewish economy, Jewish culture, Jewish education system. People look at this and they generally say, wow, the Jewish people is, by any normal measure, ready for a country by 1939. By 1939, the Jews were ready for a country. So why is this so important? And pretty much anyone that looks at this agrees. There aren't too many people I've ever shown that chart to. It's obvious. The Jewish people was ready for a country, meaning the British should have left, and we should have had independence sometime before 1939. Why is that crucial? Well, it's crucial to point out for 2 reasons. One is that it shows, I think, 2 things that are really important. One is it it kind of busts the myth that Israel was created because of the Holocaust. People often think that Israel was created because of the Holocaust. Now, the timing, of course, has to do with the Holocaust, meaning the world finally says, okay, Jews, you can have your independence. Yes, that's true after the Holocaust. But what I'm trying to show you actually is that we already had a fully functioning country before the Holocaust. By 1939, which is before World War II, there was already 400,000 Jews. We had our own independent government, self-defense, economy, education system. We had a whole functioning country here before the Holocaust. So our people that hate Israel, many, Palestinians and others, they often say, hello, you can't steal our land just because the Holocaust happened. If you want to give someone else, if you're so sad about the Holocaust, then give the Jewish people a state in Germany. That's why are you punishing us for what the Germans did? And the truth of the matter is, if that was true, I actually would agree with them. If it was true that Israel existed because of the Holocaust and we stole their land because of the Holocaust, I would agree with the Palestinians that that's not a good reason to make a country. That's not true. There's multiple things wrong with the claim, but they make the claim. And what I'm trying to show you, first of all, is that Israel does not exist because of the Holocaust. Israel actually existed before the Holocaust. The only reason we weren't independent is because the British refused to leave, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Which I think is a really important point. It's an important point. A lot of times Jews don't realize how mistaken, but also how damaging it is to say things like Israel exists because of the Holocaust, when the truth is, on a certain level, you're feeding into the Palestinian narrative, which is not true, right? In fact, I'll even go even further. One could make the claim that Israel exists in spite of the Holocaust, because the Holocaust, with all due respect, the Holocaust killed about a third of the people that could have moved here and helped establish this country into an even quicker and even greater and larger country. But so many of the people that would have and could have moved here, of course, never got to even see it get created because of the Shoah. And so I think it's crucial to point out, number one, we already had a fully functioning country before the Holocaust. And the only reason it wasn't independent is because the British refused to leave. It's also important to realize, of course, that I think this is a separate point. This is not the point of the lecture tonight, but I will throw it out there. That when you realize that we had a fully functioning country before the Holocaust, and the British were supposed to leave once we had a functioning country, once we were, according to the language of the mandate, once we were politically and economically ready for a country, that's when the British are supposed to turn it over to us. Well, that should have happened before the Holocaust. By 1939, certainly, even earlier, but by 1939, definitely. The British don't just not leave. They will prevent Jews from moving to Israel before the Holocaust and during the Holocaust. And by the way, even amazingly, even after the Holocaust. And it's important to realize, again, this is not the subject of the lecture, but I will just point out that while it is the Nazis, the German Nazis who perpetrated the Holocaust, the British, in my opinion, this might be a bit of an extreme thing to say, but I can't get away from it. The British are complicit. The British was holding onto our land. And if they would have allowed Jews just to move here, hundreds of thousands, if not multiple millions of Jews could have and would have been saved from the Nazis. And the fact of the matter is, I think it's important to point out the British responsibility for what happened to us in Germany. The Nazis perpetrated it, but the British, unfortunately, are complicit. I don't think that they did it on purpose. They weren't hoping for a Holocaust to happen to the Jews, but they knew it was happening, and they didn't just do nothing to stop it. They continued to prevent Jews from moving here even after everything was known. Even after the Holocaust was over, they continued to prevent Jews from moving here. So I'm not angry at modern day British, but I am still angry and bitter at the British from once upon a time, because they're absolutely responsible partially for what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust. Anyway, but what I want to talk about mostly tonight is why they didn't leave. Okay, why did the Jews not? Why didn't the British leave? So there's two reasons why they don't leave. Okay, one is simple colonialism. The British, of course, are the world experts on colonialism. The British, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire. The British loved their colonies. That's what they did. They spent centuries collecting colonies from all around the world, controlling shipping routes, and making a lot of money off their colonies. Of course, India being the most important one, but Palestine, the most important name in the history of religion, that was a status symbol for the British, and the British were not happy about giving up Palestine. So that's first of all, that's one reason they don't leave. Second reason they don't leave, and this is what I really want to get into tonight mostly, is because the Arabs and the Jews here are already fighting. And they didn't want to just leave and have the country kind of like delve into just chaos. And so one reason the British stay is for their own colonial self-interest. But another reason they don't leave is because it would have been somewhat irresponsible because the Jews and the Arabs here are fighting each other. So let's talk about what that looks like. So here's what happens. This is the way I look at the decades of the British, what's called the League of Nations Mandate or the British Mandate. There's going to be a cycle that will repeat itself 3 times. I mentioned there was 5 5 major waves of immigration. So we're going to talk about the third, fourth, and fifth, because those were under the British. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to have an aliyah. A bunch of Jews will move here. And then you're going to have the local Arabs are going to riot. Okay? I don't mean rioting. I don't mean like, let's just put it this way. When an Arab riot is really a euphemism for terrorism against civilians. In most cases, there's going to be serious amounts of murder. And other things, but violence in general, including murder. So Jews move here, Arabs riot against these Jews. The British don't know what to do. So the British send a commission, and that's a delegation of people to come and study. And why are the Arabs rioting? Because the British, of course, want to keep the peace in their, I'll call it a colony. It was their mandate, but it was basically like their colony. Why are the Arabs rioting? And the British, of course, conclude the truth, which is the Arabs are rioting. Just follow back up the screen because of the aliyah, because of the massive wave of Jews moving here. So what do? If that's why the Arabs are rioting, how do you solve it? Well, you issue a white paper, which is a British law. In this case, British laws that limited Jewish rights in Palestine, especially Jewish immigration to Palestine. That's what they're going to do. So I'll just mention a couple examples, okay? In the third aliyah, which is 1923, the first major terrorism against Jews in this country is 1921. I don't know if you realize this. Terrorism against Jews in this country, of the likes that we've unfortunately been experiencing over the last couple months, began in 1921. People think maybe the conflict started in like 1948, or some people say, no, it started in 1967 no, the conflict started in 1921. The way it is now. Massive amounts of terrorism against Jews in this land started in 1921. Here you had 47 Jews killed in 1 month, and that was kind of the beginning of terrorism as we know it. Winston Churchill is going to come and try to figure out what the problem is. And what he's going to do is he's going to, for the first time ever, violate the League of Nations mandate. They were supposed to help Jews move here. Well, guess what they're doing now? They're restricting Jewish immigration into Palestine, directly violating the League of Nations mandate. Now, of course, like the UN, the League of Nations, was all talk, and they didn't do anything about it, obviously. But this is what happened. The British begin to violate the mandate. I'll just mention 2 more things for later. They also offer the Jews and the Arabs to self-govern, right? Each group should self-govern in the country. And then we're going to make a council to try to decide what will we do about this country. And it'll be made up of Arabs, Jews, and British. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Now, in addition, by the way, so that's called the Churchill White Paper. Now, at the exact same time, something else will happen. And that something else is the British will realize, they'll say, maybe the League of Nations made a mistake. Maybe we should not have maybe this is too much of the Middle East going to the Jews. Maybe we should be giving less of it to the Jews. In which case, here's what we'll do. We will actually exercise, there's a clause in the mandate that says we can't give any of the land away. But there's another clause about 20 clauses later that says, for national security purposes, we actually can give part of the mandate away. So this is what's going to happen in 1922. In 1922, 80% of Palestine is going to be taken away from the Jewish state and made into an Arab country called Transjordan. And that's over here. So what happens is everything west of the Jordan River stays theoretically the Jewish state, but 80% of what was supposed to be the Jewish state, all of this over here that you see to the east of the Jordan River, is going to be lopped off and basically given to this Arab family called the Hashemite family to make into an entirely Arab country. Any Jew that lived here had to move, by the way. There weren't many, but there were a few. They had to leave. No Jew could live there. To this day, Jews cannot buy land in Jordan legally, and that goes all the way back to the British and League of Nations. Anyway, so all of a sudden, 80%. Now, this is, believe it or not, this is the first attempt ever at a 2-state solution. Because one of the motivations here was, okay, the Arabs are rioting. We should try to appease them. We should try to calm them down. And one of the ways we'll do that is, we'll say, okay, Arabs, you know what? You were right. There's more of you in Palestine. We probably shouldn't have promised it all to the Jews. You can have 80% of it. I would have hoped already that would have been the end of the conflict, right? If the Arabs are getting the entire Middle East, and now the one area that was not going to go to the Arabs, they're now getting 80% of that. It's a pretty good deal for the Arabs. We all know that that's not what happened. That's not how it's seen, but that was how it was seen back then. That was one of the reasons for making the country of Jordan. Now, um, there was other reasons for making the country of Jordan too, but that was one of them. First ever attempt at a two-state solution to try to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, really before it kind of spirals too far to control. The fourth Aliyah, which ends in 1928. Okay, the most infamous kind of pre-state terrorism against Jews was in a place called Hebron. So it's called the Hebron Massacre of 1929. These are a few images of this is a synagogue that was ransacked in 1929 in Hebron. This is a family, of course, that was wounded, but over 60 people were murdered in Hebron that day. I'm just going to read to you a few lines from a first-person account of what happened in Hebron all the way back in 1929. And I think it'll be obvious to you why I'm reading this to you. Friday afternoon, the situation worsened. We heard that Arabs had already beaten several Jews with clubs. Next, we heard that all the Jewish stores had closed. Everyone was afraid to go out in the street. Cars kept racing back and forth through the streets. They were filled with Arabs, armed with long iron bars and long knives and axes. The Arabs kept screaming that they were going to Jerusalem to slaughter the Jews. They were going from house to house, slaughtering everyone inside. The screams and moans were terrible. People were crying, "Help, help!" But what could we do? As we lay there on the floor, we heard the screams as the Arabs were slaughtering Jews. It was unbearable. Now, that's just one little excerpt of something that goes on for about 5 pages. Of course, I'm reading this to you now because in the light of October 7th, it's incredible to realize just how long the same phenomenon has been happening to the Jewish people, right? People, and I'll just point out now that this happened in 1929. So an exact repeat on a smaller scale of October 7th. I mean, that narrative, I could have sent you the exact same quotes from October 7th. This happened in 1929. This happened 100 years ago, okay? Almost 100 years ago. And I just want to point out that there are a lot of Palestinian supporters, Israel haters, who justify and basically apologize for, I'll call them terrorist apologists, okay? They basically justify terrorism against Jews. They justified October 7th, and they justify other things. And the way they do it, of course, is they say, well, Israel, you do X, Y, and Z, right? You basically had it coming because, they don't say you had it coming, but basically is what they say. Because, and they can list all kinds of, any number of things. They say, well, Israel, I don't know, you occupied the West Bank, or Israel, you stole their land, or Israel, you build settlements, or Israel, the Israeli army is cruel, or whatever, any of these accusations, which are most, somewhere between completely false and mostly false. Of course, when people do this, I assume you've heard people do this. I mean, if you read the news, if you're on social media in any way, you basically see October 7th, they'll say, I don't really support violence against Jews, but with all due respect, Israel, you did X, Y, and Z, right? You do build settlements. The Israeli army has been occupying their land for X. Well, here's the important thing to realize. The Hebron massacre happened in 1929. 1929 is, well, if Israel occupied their land, so to speak, in the Six-Day War of 1967, well, that's 50 years before we ever occupied their land. And by the way, 20 years before the state of Israel was declared. This is 1929. The state of Israel won't even exist for 20 years, meaning terrorism against Israelis. You can't say terrorism against Israelis or Jews is because of the settlements or because of the occupation or because the IDF does X, Y, or Z or because of we stole their land, whatever it might be. Because terrorism existed before that. Right? This is 1929. There's no state of Israel. There's no settlements. There's no IDF. There's no right-wing, government. There's no any of these accusations that you hear against Israel to justify terrorism. Well, guess what? 1929 was long before any of them. 1929 was before the state of Israel even existed. So what was the justification for the exact same phenomenon back then? The burden of proof is on these people that try to justify terrorism with all these supposed sins of Israel, when even if you believe those sins are true, which they're not.
I think he froze. He will be back.
Hey, sorry. Wait. Hear me now? Hear me now? Yeah, okay, good. Sorry about that. Like I said, I'm having internet problems today. I had a feeling that might happen. I hope it doesn't happen again. So the point is, of course, that terrorism as a phenomenon existed long before any of these supposed sins that Israel commits all the time, which again are not true. Those sins aren't even true. But even if you believe that Israel's guilty of these things, you've still got to explain why terrorism existed long before these things. Because again, the burden of proof is on these people. Because this is before Israel ever set foot in Gaza, ever set foot in the West Bank, and before the IDF, and before any settlements, and before anything. So I think to me that's a very, very, very important point. Um, okay, actually having a problem here because it signed me out. I really apologize because it signed me out. All of a sudden, I'm no longer the host, and it won't let me share my screen. And I really would like to share my screen with you.
Danny, does it tell you who is the host?
Let me see. Let me see. Let's see. Let's take a look at this. I think, I guess Alicia. Alicia is a host.
Interesting.
Alicia, are you there?
Good time for a quick bio break.
I may be able to claim the host. Let me see if I can do that. Hold on. Oh, that's so frustrating. Sorry. I'm sorry about this. Let me see if I can claim that.
Take your time.
What's that?
Take your time.
Okay. Okay, no, I'm still so much more to say. I don't want to waste time on this stuff. Okay, let me see if I can do it. I don't think I can actually. Oh, does anybody have Alicia's phone number by any chance? Because I don't think Alicia, are you there? I don't see her there. Oh, yes. Alicia is there. Alicia, is there any chance you can make me the host? Because you're the host right now for some reason. When it signed me out, it made you the host, Alicia. Is there any chance you could assign me the host? No?
Danny, if not, can you share your slideshow in the chat and people can look at it independently?
I could do that. I'm wondering if a better option. Yeah. Oh man, I'm wondering if a better option would just be to. I can send you a new link. I can send my own personal link, and then we could just meet on that link in a second. Should we just do that?
JNF wants to have the recordings. That's the
Okay. Okay. Let me just try to claim the host for one more. I don't see it. Usually I have an option here to claim host. I don't see it here for some reason. Let me just try another minute of this. This is so frustrating.
Maybe you can you hold it up to the camera, like so that we'll be able to see it?
Oh, I could put on my phone and then hold it up. That's so funny. That might be that might be easier than telling you guys to switch slides. Maybe I'll do that actually. That's just crazy. I can't believe this. And then this recording is gonna be worthless now. Oh, it's such an important class too. Okay, hold on. I can't believe this happened. I don't know why this happened. Just give me one more second to try to claim this host, and then if not, we'll do what you just said. You know what? I'm just gonna I'll do the phone thing in 1 second. Give me one more minute. I'm just gonna call. I'm gonna make one phone call. See if this person can help me. If not, then we'll do. I'll hold the slideshow on my phone, which is crazy, but I'll do. Hold on 1 second. Okay, my boss Lisa is signing on. Hopefully, I'm gonna fix this. Hopefully, I'll keep talking in the meantime, but hopefully she'll be able to fix it. I really do apologize for that. All right, so that's an important point in and of itself. Is this this idea that terrorism was happening before any of these supposed sins that people use to justify terror to justify violence against Israelis. No, it was happening before all those things. So you can't say terrorism causes something, of course, when it was happening for decades before. Anyway, and I think it's important to realize, I read those quotes to you because I want you to realize just how exactly similar terrorism was against Jews in the 20s. I could have read you a different account from the 30s or the 40s. I mean, unfortunately, this is the modern day terrorism. It is the same phenomenon that's been happening for 100 years, which I think is crucially important to understand. Now, let's move on. So that was the fourth aliyah. The fifth aliyah is going to be, I mentioned a few minutes ago, the fifth aliyah is the largest aliyah. Okay, the fifth aliyah was 235,000 people. So you would imagine, hey Lisa to the rescue. The fifth aliyah is the largest aliyah, okay? And the largest aliyah is unsurprisingly going to lead to the largest riots. And so what you have is the fifth aliyah, 235,000 people moved to Israel, and the Arabs respond. The riots are not just it's not local riots, not a few incidents. It's a 3-year long what we call the Arab Revolt, where 500 Jews actually were murdered over 3 years in this Arab Revolt. There's a lot to know about in general. This was a crazy time here in the land of Israel. But from 1936 to 1939, you have something called the Arab Revolt, 3-year long wave of terrorism against Israelis. The British are at a loss. They don't know what to do. So what they do is they decide to let's just place it like this. In 1917, with the Balfour Declaration, the British were basically pro-Zionist. They believed that the Jews should have a country in Israel and that the Arabs would get the rest of the Middle East, and that was a fair deal. The Arabs get the entire Middle East, and the Jews get a little slice. Basically what they said. Well, over time, the British are going to completely turn against Zionism. A little bit in 1922 with the Churchill White Paper. It's going to happen again in 1929, and then it happens officially, finally, in 1939. In 1939, the British will issue the infamous MacDonald White Paper. Okay, the MacDonald White Paper basically was the death knell for Zionism. It said, first of all, so here's the British so-called solution. What they said was, over the next 5 years, only 15,000 Jews will be allowed to make Aliyah to Israel every single year. Okay, now that's in and of itself, and that's the worst part, because there's more to it than just that. But think about this for a second. This is beginning in 1939. They say that for 5 years, only 15,000 Jews a year can make Aliyah. Well, how many Jews do you think wanted to make Aliyah in the 5 years starting 1939? So if you're thinking the number 6 million, then you and I are on the same page. Okay, because unfortunately that's how many Jews, right, are going to die in Europe because they couldn't move to Israel. So first of all, 15,000 Jews a year can make Aliyah, which again is what I said before. Great, I see that I'm the host now, so perfect. Thank you so much for all your help, Lisa and Zoe. Apologize for that. Thank you very much for taking care of that. Hopefully it doesn't happen again. All right, so fifth Aliyah. So you have the church. So you have what's called the MacDonald White Paper. Okay, MacDonald White Paper, which says 15,000 Jews a year can make Aliyah for the next 5 years. After this period, Jews will be 1/3 of the country. The country will be a democracy, which means it will be an Arab state with a 1/3 Jewish minority. That's their solution for what we should do about the fact that Jews and Arabs are fighting in this land. There's an Arab revolt for 3 years. And so the solution is to end Zionism. There won't be a Jewish state. There's going to be a country in which 1/3 the Jews of the population will be Jewish, and it will be an Arab country, and there will be officially no Jewish state. So Zionism is now over. And not only that, but now if you're wondering, by the way, did the British know that the Holocaust was about to happen? Well, this quote is going to more or less summarize that. This quote came out of the Zionist movement in 1939 as a response to, remember, Hitler was already elected 6 years earlier. It is in the darkest hour of Jewish history that the British government proposes to deprive the Jews of their last hope and to close the road back to their homeland. So yes, the British, we already knew who Hitler was. He was already elected 6 years earlier. And unfortunately, the Holocaust will happen partially because the British will not allow the Jews to come to Israel at all. Only 15,000 Jews a year. Now, meanwhile, There's another attempt. Not only do they issue the McDonald White Paper, there's one more thing. I'll go back 2 years. 1937, though, 1937, the British are going to issue, this is going to be the second attempt at a two-state solution. So the first attempt was with the creation of Jordan. Second attempt is going to be something called the Peel Commission, 1937. And this is the map of the Peel Commission. So remember that 80% of the Jewish state was already given away to the Arabs. That was called Transjordan. Now it's called Jordan. Okay? And then what they're going to do, the pink is the Arab state and the blue is the Jewish state. And this is a British international zone. Okay? Meaning the largest Jewish community, which is Jerusalem, is not going to be in the Jewish state. But more importantly, another 80% of the land is given to the Arabs. So if you know your math, which I don't, but somebody once told me, 20% of 20% is apparently 4%. Okay? So you're talking about, we are now getting, according to the Peel Commission, 4% of what was originally promised to us. And the idea was, well, it'll be based on where Jews are the majority. Jews were the majority in this area. Yes, you're the majority in Jerusalem too, but you can't have that because it's Jerusalem. So this will be the Jewish state, the blue, and the pink will be the Arab state. No, it doesn't take too much of a genius to realize that is not a great deal for the Jewish people. It's a pretty good deal for the Arabs, especially considering that they were already given 80% of it over here in Transjordan. Now, it's a good deal for the Arabs, unless, of course, unless you think that Jews have no right to any of it. If you think Jews have no right to any of it, of course, because we're colonialists, and all we are is settler colonialists, and we are a bunch of people that have no right to this land whatsoever, then this is just more basically thievery. And of course, and unfortunately, that's going to be the reaction of the Arab world. The Arab world will reject. So this is crazy. Just so you know about the Peel Commission, the Zionist movement debated this like crazy. Do we accept this or not? In the end, look at this map. The Zionist movement reluctantly accepted this map. Said, if the world's offering us a country, we're going to take it, even if it's only this. Why didn't it happen? It didn't happen because the Arab world rejected the Peel Commission, which every time I say that, I'm like shocked again. If you look at the map and think about the fact that what's happening in the Middle East now, think about this was offered to the Palestinians as a Palestinian state. And by the way, Jordan was already made into basically a Palestinian state or a state for Arabs. I would expected that the Arabs would accept this. Nope, they don't. The Jews accepted this map incredibly, and the Arabs rejected it incredibly. And then the British, of course, do what I said before. And then the British, I was getting ahead of myself. And then the British say, well, okay, well, that didn't work. So now we'll do the McDonald White Paper, which is we'll just end Zionism. Jews can't move here. And this is basically going to turn into one state, which will be 2/3 Arab, 1/3 Jewish, no Jewish state. All right. Now I'll say one last thing about this, which is the logic behind it. The logic, what was the point of the Peel Commission? They basically said was something that still holds to this day. They basically said that there are two nations in this land, the Jews and the Arabs. They each have claims on this land which are legitimate, and they can't get along. So if there's two nations, they each have claims on the land, and they can't get along, what do? You find a way to share it or split it up or partition it. You find a way to separate, and so each nation can have their nationalism kind of realized within the land. In some ideal, maybe in some ideal world, we'd all get along. We can make one state together. That was already in the 1930s. The British decided that was unrealistic. All the more so people say nowadays. So the solution, of course, should be if you can't do one state, so you do two. You've probably heard this before, a two-state solution. That's the logic behind it. The logic behind it was already basically laid out in the 1930s, which is two nations, can't get along, so let's share it, let's find a way to split it up. And shockingly, the Jewish people accept this, the Arabs reject it. All right. Now, that leads us then, and that's more or less, if I was teaching history class, I would say, and that's the next thing we'll learn about, of course, is what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust. But what I want to do now is something else. What I want to do for the rest of our time tonight is I want to try to understand deeply the Palestinian narrative. Why is it that they rejected seemingly such a great deal? It was such a great deal. Why did they reject it? What do you think? Why they reject it? And why this overall narrative that they have, which is that we are foreign colonizers, is so problematic and so wrong, and how it's really, you'll see in a second. So first of all, let's understand their case, okay? Because their case is not completely crazy. It's incorrect, but it's not completely crazy. Because here's what they say. They say, you Jews, you're whatever you are. You're good people, you're smart people, you're moral people, and all these things about all these Jews around the world. But I want to make the claim for a second. I want to make the case for a second for the Palestinians, because you all think we're just violent or we're stubborn, or I don't know what you think we are. But as a Palestinian, I'll speak as a Palestinian. Obviously, I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but this is exactly basically what they say. They say, of course, I'm not going to compromise with you. You know why? Because look at the census. Look at the population. Let's look at 1922. Okay, this is the British census that was taken. Different population. So let's look at 1922. This is the time period when the League of Nations says this land should become a Jewish national home. Well, if you believe, just one more second, I'll come back to this in a second, but if you believe in what's called self-determination, you believe, and of course I hope we all do here, believe in self-determination, the idea that a nation should rule itself, that it was wrong for the British to be in India, and it was wrong for America to be in the Philippines, and it was wrong for the Dutch to be in Indonesia. We believe that a nation should rule themselves, that colonialism is bad. I think everyone should be on the same page that colonialism is bad. I think that's obvious. And so the Palestinians say, well, if you agree that that's bad, and I really do, Danny Stein, I really do believe it's bad. Well, if you believe that's bad, then how do you justify this? Because look at 1922. The country had at the time 667,000 Arabs and 84,000 Jews. That was the population of the country in 1922. That's when the League of Nations and the British talked about turning this into a Jewish state. So as a Palestinian, why would I basically, what are we? What are we like? Are we just objects to be moved around? Do we not get self-determination? Do we not have any rights? I mean, why should this be so the answer, by the way, is Jews were 12% of the country. 12%. So a Palestinian would say, how do you possibly justify, you Jews? How do you possibly justify making a Jewish state in this land when we were 88%, we the Palestinians were 88%, and you were only 12%? It's just colonialism. And you might say, well, there was a war and we won the war. So I want to talk about that for just 1 second. I want to say that actually, in general, that actually is the only justification for most countries to exist. Most countries exist just because they won the war, basically. There was wars for years, and eventually one party won the deciding war, and that's why that country exists. That is, the vast majority of countries exist purely based on military might. The vast majority of countries. Interestingly enough, nobody thinks that that's a legitimate reason for us to exist. Okay, which actually it should be. We should be able to judge ourselves by the same standards as everyone else, which is when there's a war and one side wins, that creates a country. But I actually want to, for our purposes tonight, I want to make sure that everyone is on board. That I think we should have a better reason to exist than just that. Okay, because it's true we won the war. That's true. But I'd like to talk about Israel's moral justification for existing. Why should the state of Israel exist when Palestinians say, basically, what are we? We're thieves. They say, we're not going to compromise with you. Why? Because look at this. We were the vast majority. You were the minority. The British come in and give it to you. That's colonialism, and you should have refused. And you should leave. If you really care about Palestinians, right? All these are kind of like woke young Jews, unfortunately. There's Jews amongst them who basically look at this and say, yeah, I guess so. I guess they were the majority. We're the minority. So we don't really deserve a country. And the Palestinians say, yeah, that's right, you're colonialist. And these young people say, yep, colonialism, that's what it looks like, that's what it sounds like. What I want to explain is why there's so many reasons why that's false. So let's talk about there's the basic idea. But the claim here is, of course, this. The claim here is that they say, why don't we compromise? Why do we reject the Peel Commission? Because you stole our land. Stop stealing our land. If someone, with all due respect, if somebody invaded your home and kicked you out and then offered to give you back half of it, you wouldn't say, oh, what a great deal, right? This is what Palestinians say. Someone invaded your house and kicked you out and offered to give you back half of it. You would not accept that. You would wait and you'd find a way to get your whole house back because it's yours. So that's how the Palestinians see this conflict. They say we invaded their country. We had no right to it whatsoever. And therefore, they're not going to accept when we offer to give back half. That's basically the entire Palestinian narrative, okay? We are foreign colonizers who have no right here. We invaded it, And the just thing to do to colonizers is to kick them out. And now you hear words like by any means necessary, which is an extension of, if we're really colonists, if we're really what the British were in India, then you can understand why violence is, I don't support violence, but I do support decolonization, right? You'll hear this all the time. So let's understand why this is, what's wrong with this narrative, okay? But in general, the idea, you hear this, right? Zionist settler colonialism, right? This is the claim here. But if we are a bunch of settler colonists that have, you've probably seen this map before, slowly but surely stole the Palestinians' land. There's so many things wrong with this map. This is a hilarious piece of propaganda. It's ridiculous, actually. I'm not going to go into that now. It's kind of a separate class. You have a whole class on what's wrong with this map when Palestinians use this map as the stolen Palestinian land map. But you'll see it all the time. Okay, I think this is also an example of it, right? More or less, you'll see it all the time. Anyway, it's absurd, but they do it all the time. Okay. But let's talk about for a few reasons why, well, there are some superficial similarities between Jews moving here and colonialism, why it's so far from it. So first of all, there's a number of things to just throw out there. You have to understand a bit about what colonialism is. So I don't want to do too much of that, but just briefly. In colonialism, you have basically a mothership, okay, that sends out its settler colonists, to colonize a place, and for the benefit of the mothership, of the metropole, basically is what it's called, right? That's how colonialism works. So the first thing that's wrong with this claim, of course, is that there is no Jewish, mothership. There's no Jewish mother country. This idea that Jews, and this is, if you read modern articles, this is what the Palestinians are unfortunately not getting through their heads, and why they keep stumbling over their own problem. They want us to go back where we came from, right? Well, with all due respect, where are the Jews going back to? Is every Jew going to move to New York and LA and Philly? I don't think so, right? You're not going to have the entire Jewish community of the world move to the United States of America. There's a reason why the Zionist movement didn't choose that, and it wouldn't have worked for a number of reasons. Okay, so this idea that the Jews should go back where they came from, well, there is no where they came from. I mean, should we go back to Russia and Germany and Poland? I don't think so. What about all the Jews from the Middle East? What about the ones from Iraq and from Syria and from Lebanon and from Egypt and from Morocco? And where exactly is, right? So you have that one issue with the whole colonialism accusation, of course, is that this is not colonialism, right? There is no mothership that sent the Jews to go colonize and take its resources. And the other major, just in terms of definitions, legal immigration is not colonialism, right? The Jewish people came to this land as immigrants, as refugees, basically. They're running for their lives in most cases, running from these pogroms in Russia. It's so funny because most of the people that hate Israel in America now, like all these, woke progressives, are also the people who are most in favor of refugee rights and immigrant rights. Well, with all due respect, are these people really making the claim that legal immigration and being a refugee is equivalent to colonialism? Because I don't think they would make that claim for any other nation, but for some reason they do for us. For some reason, immigration of Jews to Israel is colonialism, but immigration of any other people to anywhere else is just immigration, or being a refugee. But no, Jewish immigration to Israel, that's colonialism. The hypocrisy should be quite clear. So it's important to just throw out that yes, while it's true, many Jews came from Europe, other Jews came from other places in the Middle East, but immigration is not colonialism. Being a refugee is not colonialism. But there's more to it than just that. Other reasons why Israel, this is the most important part here. Right? Since this is not colonialism, what is the Jewish, why should there be a state here? Why do Jews have rights to this country? What is the Jewish claim here? If we were 12% and they were 88%, which is true. So how do we have rights here? Well, let's talk about these four major ones, okay? First of all, there's deep Jewish historical connections to this land. That's obvious, okay? It's obvious to most people. Why do I write here it's indisputable, or at least it should be? Because since the Palestinians, unfortunately, started to push this narrative of zero compromise, because you're colonialists, part of the Palestinian kind of toolkit is to deny Jewish history in Israel. And so the most, in one of the most infamous examples, I mean, it's all over, Palestinian literature, but even moderate Palestinians like the Palestinian ambassador to the United States of America, who's an educated, moderate Palestinian. A couple of years ago, I forget, this might have been 10 years ago, he was asked on television, do you think there was ever a Jewish temple in Jerusalem? And this is a moderate, educated Palestinian, and he refused to answer the question. The reason being that the minute, if you're a Palestinian, the minute you agree that there's some Jewish history here, all of a sudden there's you put the hole in their major narrative, which is that Jews have no right to this place whatsoever. Because once you say there's Jewish history here, oh, all of a sudden maybe there is some little Jewish right to be here, but they don't want to say it, right? And so they basically twist themselves into like a pretzel to try to deny all of Jewish history. Because the minute you admit to some Jewish history in this land, all of a sudden this narrative of zero compromise is less valid. So first of all, one reason countries exist is if you have a historical connection. If that's where your history is, that's where your country becomes, right? There's a reason why it would not make sense for the Jewish state to be in Italy. It wouldn't make sense, but it does make sense for it to be here. Secondly, there's never been a time with no Jews here. You should know that most Jews left here because of the Romans I mentioned, but there are families that can trace their lineage back 2,000 years to pre-Roman times. There's like one family you can actually go visit this woman. She's 96 years old, amazing woman. But there's a few families in Israel that never, ever, ever left. There's an of Jewish settlement here, which is important. Again, none of this means that this land should all be ours, but it does mean we have some right here the way other countries have a right to their land. We've got history here. We've had presence in land basically forever. Jews, this is an important one. Jews bought the land completely legally with full transparency. We spoke this already. Until the war that was started in 1947, every Jew lived on Jewish-owned property, right? There was no Jew living anywhere besides the land that they had purchased legally and publicly with full transparency. That's important, right? Property rights are important. If you are a landowner, then it's yours. And finally, of course, there's the cultural and religious connection to this land. Prayers are towards this land. Weddings, we break the glass. Jews had been moving here and visiting this land forever. Every time we say a prayer or a blessing or Birkat Hamazon, benching after the meals, we talk about returning here. I mean, there's a hugely, unbelievably strong connection culturally and religiously between Jews in this land. So all I'm trying to say with this whole slide is Jews have rights here. The same reason why any country has any right to exist wherever it exists. Jews have all those things. Now, the problem is, of course, that there's also a lot of other people here. There's also a lot of Arabs here, and they've been here for a long, long, long time. So here's, I think, the most important thing. The most important thing is this. This is Chaim Weizmann. Chaim Weizmann kind of took over for Theodor Herzl in the World Zionist Organization. So he's got a really important quote in which he says, the conflict, meaning the Arab-Israeli conflict, is not between right and wrong, but rather between two rights. Okay? The two-state solution. Already back in, I think he said the 1930s. He said, we Jews have been living in this land off and on for 4,000 years. 4,000 years off and on, and all the reasons I just mentioned to you, the Jewish presence and the Jewish historical connection and the cultural connection and the fact that Jews were always here and that we bought the land, there's a really strong Jewish connection to this place. Okay? However, there's also a strong Arab connection to this place, meaning the Arabs moved in here around the year 700. They've been here for like for 700 years, for 1,400 years or so, have the Arabs. They've got holy sites here. They've got 1,400 years of history here. The Arabs, Chaim Weizmann's saying, the Arabs also have a strong connection here. And that's what Chaim's saying. It's not between right and wrong. It's between two rights, meaning we're both right. We both have rights to this land. And now let's go back to what the British said. If there's two nations that both have rights to the land, but they cannot get along, and neither one's going to go anywhere, obviously, what's the solution? The solution is to find a way to split it up. Now here's the entire, now I'm gonna give you an overview of the entire conflict right now for the next 15 minutes or so. Okay, and then we're gonna stop. But the reason why there is still a conflict to this day and why there's no Palestinian state is because, I'll go back to the quote, is because while the Jewish people has been saying this for 100 years straight, the Arabs simply generally, of course I'm generalizing here, but generally the Arab world has not ever agreed with this quote. Jews have been saying since day one, we both have rights here, so let's share it. You want the country of Jordan? Good. Is that good enough? No. Penal Commission? Good enough? No. Let's find a way, since we both have rights here, let's find a way to split it up. The Arab world, generally, by and large, almost entirely though, has never agreed with this quote that we have rights too. The Arab world generally says, no, you are settler colonists. They use the word usurpers. You are invaders. You are basically thieves who stole our land. You do not have a right to be here. Since you stole our land, we're going to get you out. We're going to get what's rightfully ours back. It's a completely different opinion of how to solve the conflict. And that's why you see, right, that's why decolonization or the whole colonialism thing is so damaging. Because if they really believe that we stole this place, then they're right not to want to compromise. Unfortunately, they're wrong. They're wrong for all these reasons. They're wrong because we have connection here. They're wrong because we lived here. They're wrong because we bought this place legally and with transparency. They're wrong because we have a huge connection here. And all I would like them to admit is that we have rights here just like they do. So let's find a way to share. And generally, over our entire history, the Arab world has rejected this idea completely. They said, no, we, the Arabs, have rights. You Jews do not. You're thieves and you're colonists. And we'll kick you out. And here is the entire list. This is Danny Stein's summary of the entire Arab-Israeli conflict in one slide. So I'm not going to explain what each one is in detail. This is the kind of thing that you, if you want, you could like take a screenshot of this. You could certainly do your own research if you want to know more about these things. But I'll go through each one for about 1 or 2 minutes, just so you can understand what I mean. Okay, and how the Arab world and the Palestinians in particular, because they reject any compromise with us, have made their situation worse and worse and worse over time. So let's explain what I mean by this. We can go all the way back to 19. Some of them are a bit out of order, but there's a reason for that. So let's go back to the 1920s. Okay, in 1922, I mentioned this earlier. There was supposed to be this legislative council made by the British in which Jews, Arabs, and British would have been on the council to decide what are we going to do with this land. Now remember that in 1922, we were only 12% of the land, meaning we were going to be 12% of the council. We were 12% of the population. So the council would have been approximately, we don't know the exact numbers, would have been about 24 Arabs, 2 Jews, and a number of British. Well, what do you think would have happened to this land if there was a council making decisions, and the council was 24 Arabs, 2 Jews, and a bunch of British? I'm pretty sure there was not going to be a Jewish state. The Arabs refused to sit on the council. They refused to sit on the council because Jews were included. They said the Jews have no right to be on this council. We will not sit with Jews to discuss the future of the place because Jews have no right to any of this place. If they would have sat on that council, there would have never been a Jewish state in the first place. Okay? They didn't. They refused because they say we have no right to be here whatsoever. That was a mistake. It's going to get worse. Here, 1920. 1920, we start governing ourselves with the Jewish agency. Okay? That was 28 years before 1948. So why is that important? Because when 1948 finally comes around, when the British eventually do leave, what do we Jews already have in place? We already have a government for 30 years. We've been governing ourselves now for 30 years. The Arabs, in protest, refused to establish their own government. They said the Jews do not deserve a government. We're not establishing our own government. And they never established their government. And so when the British finally left in 1948, what did the Arabs have? Nothing. They had a bunch of angry people that started a war, in which, and you're about to see, that they lost. So we've a 30-year government which declares independence, and the Arabs didn't have that. They could have had a government just like us in 1920, but they refused. All right, let's keep going. 1937. Let's go back to the map for a second. This is a good map if you're an Arab. Come on, right? If you are an Arab, this is a good deal, especially considering this was already given to the right. That all of Transjordan was Arab. Now this is all going to be Arab. Jews are left with 4%. This is a good deal if you're an Arab. Unless, of course, unless you believe that Jews have no right to any of it, in which case this is just colonialism and thievery, and they shouldn't allow it. And that's their opinion, which is why 1937, we accept the Peel Commission, and they reject it. Again, they could have had a state already in 1937. They refused. Let's keep going. 1939, McDonald White Paper. That I didn't even tell you this. The McDonald White Paper, which was this evil document which sentenced millions of Jews to death. The Arabs didn't even accept it. They rejected it officially. It said there's not going to be a Jewish state, but they said no. Jewish minority here of 1/3? No, that's too much for us. We're rejecting that also. They reject the Peel Commission. They reject the McDonald White Paper, which is what I spoke about a few minutes ago. 1947. What happens is over the next 10 years, there's more Jews will move here. More Jews. There's going to be more, basically, a greater establishment of more Jewish institutions. And so when the UN finally comes in 1947 and says, "Okay, there's going to be another chance at a two-state solution, just like the Peel Commission," it's going to be the UN Partition Plan. UN Partition Plan of 1947. Well, here's what it looks like. Okay, it's a very weird map, but they did it based on where Arabs were each the majority. So it made sense on a certain level, but it would have been crazy. But if you're an Arab, which deal was better? It's pretty obvious. Right? In 10 years, right, they rejected this solution. 10 years later, they got a much worse deal. So you might think that the Arab world maybe is going to reevaluate. This whole rejecting compromise with the Jews isn't working out, because look what happened. We keep rejecting compromise, and our situation keeps getting worse. What did they do? No, they don't accept the UN Partition Plan. The Jewish people immediately accepted this map and declared independence. What did the Arab world do? The Arab world declared war. 7 countries invaded from 7 different directions, tried to kill us all. And I know that, once upon a time, whatever, let's just put it this way. Jews did not feel like just getting murdered in this case. We actually decided to defend ourselves, which I think made sense. I think usually when people come to kill you, defending yourself seems like a pretty natural reaction. That's what's going to happen. The Jews defended themselves, and incredibly, we won. And so this was supposed to be the Jewish state. But when we were invaded by 7 armies from 7 different directions, we pushed them back as far as we can. And look what happened in the map. Now, if you're a Palestinian, your situation now was made worse again. So it's important to understand this for a second. Not only are the Arabs in general, and the Palestinians in particular, rejecting compromise, but now they're using violence to reject compromise. And when you use violence to reject compromise and to try to harm someone, those people you're trying to harm are probably going to try to defend themselves. And what happens is every time the Palestinians do this, their situation gets worse, because we Jews don't just want to roll over and die, which I think is justified. Not everyone thinks that's justified. I personally think it's justified to defend yourself. I think you would probably all agree with me. Now, so what happens is, of course, this was the map. After the war is over, this is the map. But look, the Palestinians still have what's called the West Bank, right? This was run by Jordan. The Gaza Strip, run by Egypt. We weren't in the Gaza Strip. We weren't in Jordan. We weren't in the West Bank. And so you might think after all of this, after decades now, it's now 1947, 1948. It's basically 2 decades of rejecting compromise, and the Palestinians aren't left with much. You think that maybe they're going to reevaluate and say, maybe we need to find a way to compromise with the Israelis and make peace. Not at all. Not at all. Instead, there's going to be terrorism for the next number of years. And instead, in 1967, let's go back to my slide for a second. The next thing is going to be in 1967. 19 years they could have given. Again, the Palestinians claim they want a state in the West Bank and Gaza, right? That's what they claim. They want a state in the West Bank and Gaza. Well, Israel wasn't in the West Bank or Gaza. This was run by Arabs. This was run by Arabs. They could have made a state in the West Bank and Gaza. Well, for 19 years, they don't make a state in the West Bank or Gaza. And instead, in 1967, there's another war. Syria, Jordan, and Egypt invade Israel from 3 sides and try to, in their own words, push all the Jews into the sea. There won't be any survivors. Well, we didn't want to die, which I think was justified, in my opinion. I know that sounds controversial, not wanting to die, but amazingly, we didn't want to die for some weird reason. Sorry for my cynicism. Anyway, and we won the war. We won the 6-Day War. And in the 6-Day War, we will now take over the areas that they attacked us from. We will take over the Gaza Strip. We will take over the West Bank. That's when the quote-unquote occupation of the West Bank and Gaza begins, 1967. So while it's true that we took over these majority Palestinian areas, we did this because they started a war and tried to kill us and shot at us from these areas. So, but wait a second. After, this is a really important one. A lot of people don't even know about this. After the 6-Day War, after we took over the Palestinian areas, we decided, this is probably not worth the trouble to have these Palestinian areas. There's a lot of Arabs that live here. Why don't we just make peace with these countries instead? So after the 6-Day War was over in 1967, just a few months later, the 6-Day War happened in June. In September of 67, so at the end of the summer, there was a big summit, and we offered to give back all of the land, or all, I shouldn't say all, not Jerusalem. We didn't want to give back Jerusalem. But besides Jerusalem, we offered to give back almost all of what had been won in the 6-Day War for peace. We don't want your land. We just want to be left alone and live in peace. Take all your land back. and let's live in peace together. And what the Arabs said in September of 67 was they issued what's called the Three No's proclamation, which was basically the three no's, which were, we will not recognize your right to exist, Israel, right? No recognition, no negotiations with you, Israel, and obviously no peace with Israel. So post 6-Day War, we win their areas, we offer to give it all back, and they refuse to take it back. I mean, they said, we'll take it back, you can give it to us, but we're not going to talk to you or make peace. So if you want to leave the land, leave it, but we're not going to make peace with you for it. So all of a sudden, Israel now finds itself in control of these Palestinian areas. Now, if I was a Palestinian, I would not be very happy about this. But look at the history. This is not Israel's responsibility. This war should have never been started against Israel. And if they never would have started a war against us, then we would have never been in these Palestinian areas in the first place. All right. But what happens is, over time, we recognize that controlling these Palestinian areas in the West Bank and Gaza probably just is not worth it for all kinds of reasons. We want to go back to the original logic, which is there's two nations here. They each have claims, so let's find a way to share the land. And we never gave up on that. So now we're going to fast forward to the 2000s or the 90s. Okay, let's go to 2000. In the year 2000, Israel, this is what was called Camp David. You probably remember this. In Camp David, in the year 2000, it's a big turning point in the conflict. In Camp David, Israel offered the Palestinians approximately somewhere between 92 and 95% of the West Bank and Gaza. Someone offers you 92 to 95% of what you want. I think that most people would say that's a pretty good deal. Of course, unless you think, of course, that they stole it all in the first place, in which case, no, that's not a good enough deal. And when we offered them somewhere between 92 and 95% of the West Bank, they didn't just say no. They said no and started the Second Intifada, which was 3 years of suicide bombings in which 1,000 Israelis were killed. So when we tried to make peace in the year 2000, that was rejected with a war called the Second Intifada. All right, we can go even further. In 2007, I know it's a bit out of order, but it doesn't matter. 2007, we're going to offer in the Annapolis, 2007, 2008, in what's called the Annapolis Conference. We offered them 98% of the West Bank. 98%. We said, okay, the year 2000 wasn't good enough. We offered you 92, 95%. Now we'll offer you 98% of what you want. Someone offers you 98% of what you want. Is that a pretty good deal for you? I think so. I think in most worlds, someone offers you 98% of what you want, right? If there's a compromise happening and one side's getting 98%, that's a pretty good deal. Now, why not 100%? That's a long discussion. We could talk a different time. But there were certain areas in the West Bank that Israel decided we do not want to give up, whether they be holy areas or strategic areas. At 98%, we were willing to part with. Again, the Palestinians are going to say no. Okay? Now, let's talk about Gaza for a second. In the year 2005, Israel says, you know what? Gaza Strip, this is not worth our time. In retrospect, it was a lot of people would say this was a mistake, but we said it was not worth our time and our energy and whatever. We simply gave the Gaza Strip without a peace deal, simply gave it to the Palestinians. 2005, we said we used to be there, our army was there, we had Jews living there. We said, no, we'll forcibly take all the Jews out, we'll take the army out of Gaza, just take it and turn it into your state. Well, what happened in Gaza? In Gaza, it was not turned into a state. What was it turned into? We know now. It was turned into a giant missile launching pad and a giant hornet's nest of tunnels and terrorism. And now, how do Palestinians live in Gaza? Not very well, to say the least. What about the West Bank? The West Bank, right? We offered to give them the West Bank in 2000. And what happens then? Well, Israel says, we can't have that. We don't want to just get blown up in restaurants. We're going to build a big fence between you and us. We're going to have checkpoints between you and us. And what happens is every single time the Palestinians reject compromise, and they do it with violence, what happens to their situation? Their situation gets worse and worse and worse every single time. And the most recent, of course, is in 2020. In 2020, four Arab countries made peace with Israel, right? Morocco, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain. They make peace with Israel. And the Palestinians theoretically could have got on board with that. Okay, there's peace happening between Arabs and Israel. Let's get on board. Nope. They told the UAE, you stabbed us in the back. They wouldn't let them visit the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock. They shouted them away. The idea of making peace with Israel is stabbing the Palestinians in the back. So rather than trying to make peace when there was a peace train happening in 2020, it was the exact opposite. Total rejection. And the end result is, let's go back to my slide. I'm done in just 1 second. So I hope that this was not too long, but the end result, if you look at this, you have 100 years, basically, 100 years of Palestinian rejectionism, of rejecting compromise because they believe falsely that we have no right to this place whatsoever. If at any point in this 100 years, the Palestinian people or the Arab world in general would have said, the Jews have rights here too, so let's find a way to compromise with them, right? Even if they're only 12%, so we'll have 88%, they'll have 12%, whatever it is, but they have some rights to some of this place, let's compromise. If they would have done that, they could have had a state in 1920. They could have had a state in 1937. They could have had a state in 1947. They could have had a state in the year 2000. They could have had a state in the year 2007. They could have had a state in the year 2005 in Gaza. Instead, every time they're given a chance to compromise, they reject that compromise, often with violence, and make their situation much, much worse. And so the end result, of course, is if you're a Palestinian, what do you have now? And the answer is not a whole lot. I wouldn't want to be Palestinian. I would not want to be a Palestinian. But I completely, as an Israeli, reject responsibility for their problems. The responsibility falls on their leadership for rejecting compromise for 100 years straight. And there you have your, I don't know, 13 examples or something of when that happened. So I'll stop there, I think, and I'll obviously take questions if anybody has. I threw a lot at you, but that's basically this is what I would say, this is the real issue in the conflict is what I'll call Palestinian rejectionism, which has been their unofficial but obvious policy for 100 years straight. And it's led them nowhere. It's led them to misery, basically, because they keep, if you really believe someone stole something from you, then you're going to fight to get it back. They never should have thought that in the first place. We didn't steal anything from them in the first place, and we were never colonialists like the British. We were a nation of immigrants and refugees legally coming back to a place we once lived. So let's find a way to work it out.